Hello. Sorry, bit weird. Inexplicably turned into Kermit the Frog there as an intro. Hello, this is Owen Jones on YouTube. We did stop doing the Thursday live shows, but I just thought ad hoc. I mean, I wasn't going to go out to the pub, was I? So I thought ad hoc, we'd do occasional shows. If you're watching live, hello. If you're listening to the podcast, also hello. The podcast has been going very strong, which has been very exciting. Do leave a review and 5 stars if you're new on the podcast. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do so. I'm going to kick off. Before I do, we've got a very, very exciting program today. Okay, look, I know the title's depressing, and various experts on political framing have been in touch to say the title is a big no-no. You should not do catastrophist use catastrophist language about climate emergency. It's demobilizing. And I messed up. I probably should have said, how are we going to save humanity, rather than maybe just start on the off with, are we all going to die? I realize this is not the cheeriest time we've ever spent alive as human beings in the post-war period, as is. So maybe throwing that in hasn't helped. But that doesn't matter, because we've got 2 absolutely incredible authors, Mathew and Laurie Laybourn, who are going to come on and talk about Planet on Fire, which again is actually brimming full of alternatives, of hope. So this is going to be a very hopeful and optimistic ad hoc show. Now, just firstly, I'm going to do some basic admin. If you're watching live, please do click through to YouTube. It really helps with the show. Click subscribe and click the notification bell. And that helps you. It helps the algorithm. Like the video instantly. I mean, that's cost-free. Why wouldn't you do that anyway? Click like, and that will encourage other people to watch the video. I do appreciate most of you watch after the event, but it just helps. Also, for those who are supporting us on Patreon, so we can do documentaries and all the other stuff we're doing, podcasts, everything else. We just did this video documentary this week, which was about how companies have profited from COVID-19, like Amazon and so on. That was down to your support. So thank you so much for those who want to support us and suggest ideas for documentaries, interviews, all that kind of stuff. If you go to patreon.com/OwenJones84, that supports the team on union wages, which is great during a crisis. You can also support the channel and ask questions to the guests by using Super Chat, the little pound sign below. And I'm going to start before I bring in our guests. And I should apologize, by the way, for those watching live, watching me disintegrate. Don't do high-intensity workouts before you go on a camera. Just a little bit of basic life admin. We all learn the hard way. Now, this is what we're going to talk about to begin with. I want to talk about this because I think it's very, very important. Now, you'll all be aware that last Sunday there were protests in Bristol, which got pretty aggro. And the protests were against the policing bill, which grants the police sweeping powers to shut down any peaceful protest. It also, by the way, very important, particularly targets Roma, traveller and Gypsy communities. And the local police force afterwards, this is Somerset and Avon, they claimed in a statement that one officer had suffered a broken arm and another suffered broken ribs. Both have been taken to hospital. They also claimed in a statement that one of them also suffered a punctured lung. Now, clearly those are serious injuries, and they were treated as such by the media. So if we look at the Sun splashed on Kill the Bill protest, cop's lung collapses as he's stamped on, and another suffers broken bones. Another video published by the Sun, so I've put a video published by the Sun, which got nearly 167,000 views already. Headline: Cop's lung collapses and another bone's broken. It's the same with the broadcast media. So on Sky News, they splashed on officers suffer broken arm and ribs after Kill the Bill protests descend into violence. These protests were really widely reported across the British media. So take The Spectator. They published an article headlined, "The Bristol riots show the danger of ignoring anti-police extremism," citing the seriously injured officers in the first paragraph of that article as evidence. Now, when the Labour MP Nadia Whitten was asked on television, she said she condemned all the violence and would wait to see what actually happened. Now, she was piled on, including on Twitter, with the serious injuries such as a punctured lung frequently cited in those attacks on Nadia Whitten. One small problem with all of this After these reports were very widely circulated, the police force quietly retracted the reports on Wednesday. No officer suffered any serious injury in those protests. Hold on a minute. Let's just think about this. Maybe you're thinking, well, maybe they just didn't know how badly injured the officers were. Maybe they had possible broken bones and a possible collapsed lung. Well, they didn't say that in the statement. I mean, I just said possible, didn't I? But they didn't say that. They said as a definite. These were definite statements, which were then reported as fact. Now, I suppose the question is what medical advice were the police forces given? I'm very interested in that, which is why I got in touch with the press department of the police force. And I would love for them to answer, but they have failed to get back to me, even though I messaged them hours ago. These are press officers. It's their job to deal with annoying people like me. I know my other colleagues at the Guardian, having read their own coverage, they haven't got back to them either. So I would like to know on what basis did they, as definites, report very serious injuries, including an officer being stamped on so their lung collapsed and broken ribs and broken arms. Now, why does this matter? I think this is beyond unfortunate, should we just put it that way? Because there is an increasingly authoritarian atmosphere in this country, which with the government and its supporters intolerant of protest and dissent, hence legislation, which the protests were about, of course, the policing bill, which will allow the police to crack down. Essentially, if you look at the provisos into any protest judged to cause annoyance. The point of a protest is to cause annoyance to someone, i.e. those in power generally. That really is the point of protest. Now, these widely circulated claims of serious injuries, and it's worth pointing that the subsequent clarifications got nowhere near the same amplification. So you get these big headlines and videos going viral from the media, but then the police, just a few days later, when people aren't talking about the protest anymore, go, oh yeah, there weren't any injuries. That was serious. That helps fuel an atmosphere of demonizing protesters and supporting the police being handed more authoritarian powers to shut down our rights and freedoms that were fought for at huge cost and huge sacrifice by our ancestors, who I would know, many of whom felt the hard smack of police batons in their faces and were demonized by the media, and indeed were demonized by media outlets and the police authorities for being violent hoodlums in their day. That's just a fact. We could go back, LGBTQ activists, trade unionists, women, the suffragettes, most notably, who lauded now as secular saints. Oh boy, they were not at the time. They were terrorists and anarchists at the time. People who fought racism, people who fought for, all our rights and freedoms, to be honest, including people really, if you go back, were massacred by the state, like at the Peterloo Massacre of 1819 in Manchester. So I think there's something of a history here, which we do need to just briefly unpick before I bring in our guest to puncture, hopefully, the pessimism of the title of this video. So back in 2008, police aggressively shut down climate camp protesters near Kingsnorth Power Station. They claimed several resulting injuries. That turned out to be false. There were no injuries sustained in clashes with the protesters. One injury turned out to be an insect bite. Another was toothache. There were other examples. 2017, Sussex police admitted that their claims that several Crystal Palace fans had attempted to force entry to the Derby and Brighton and Hove Albion armed with knives and knuckle dusters. Very alarming. I think we can all agree. Fans tooled up with knives and knuckle dusters. Not good. Oh, but they were false, those reports. Didn't happen. No knives, no knuckle dusters. Widely circulated. Turned out to be false. There are far worse examples. Far worse examples. If we go back to 2009, when the homeless newspaper vendor Ian Tomlinson died at the G20 protest, which he wasn't attending, by the way. He was just on his way home at the time. It had nothing to do with it. Not that would have changed anything, by the way. Irrelevant. But the media regurgitated false briefings from the police, with the Evening Standard splashing on police belted with bricks as they helped dying man. A pack of lies. False, wrong, incorrect. Nothing correct about that. Zero. And the only reason that was proven to be false was because back then, camera phones and people had them, but there were just less of them. But thankfully, someone recorded what had happened. And if they hadn't, we might never know the truth. It would have just been these, eyewitnesses demonized as protesters. So how can we believe what they say? Would have, their word against the police. The police, we've got to believe everything the police say, and the media back them up. But it turned out, of course, that Tomlinson was struck by a police officer, and an inquest later found it was an unlawful killing. Going way back, well, not way back, the Battle of Orgreave. My dad was at Orgreave, not as a miner. This was during the miner strike in the mid-1980s, when the police charged it miners. Then the BBC ran a tape in a different order to make it look like the miners had attacked the police. A nonsense. A lie. The BBC have still not apologised for that, by the way, even though it's clear, just a fact. What they did is they changed the order of the tape. Clever. Very devious. And that cut through. Because at the time, now you see, one Labour MP, I'm not going to name, just a generic, obnoxious Labour MP, he said, he salivated over images of police battening protesters in Bristol. And he denied he salivated when I challenged him. But I think 3 clapping emojis over a video of police officers whacking protesters is pretty close to salivation. And then I pointed out people like him throughout history, miners, etc., LGBTQ activists have always done what he's done, salivated over state violence. And he said, no, I represent a mining community. I mean, he's not, he's the son of a film critic. Nothing wrong with that. If he's going to go all authentocrat on me, let's just stick to those facts. So he was like, the miners suffered police brutality. Those miners were demonized at the time. I know now people watch Pride, brilliant film, and think, everyone loves the miners. At the time, public opinion wasn't on their side. Sorry to airbrush some lies out of history. Often very hostile. The media whipped up total, unrelenting hostility to the miners, who were presented as violent totalitarian thugs, the enemy within. Margaret Thatcher called them. Let's not forget that. So this was, again, another example. I mean, another final notorious example, of course, was the Hillsborough disaster of 1989, when 96 Liverpool fans died, and the sun splashed on completely disgusting lies fed to them by the police, by those scumbags in that police force, claiming fans pickpocketed victims, urinated on cops, beat up an officer giving the kiss of life. Now, those were total lies, unreconstructed lies, and the Sun is still boycotted in Merseyside as a result. What does this tell us? Well, I shouldn't really have to spell it out, but let's just do it anyway. The police forces in this country have a long record of claiming things which, to put it mildly, turn out demonstrably to be completely and utterly untrue, which the media then uncritically lap out and then lap up and then amplify and propagate, particularly when demonized others are involved. Striking miners, working class Liverpool fans in the 1980s, who was bottom of the pile at the time as you could possibly be in that pecking order of hatred, and protesters when they're involved. And that's what they do. And they use it to whip up hysteria and hatred against their targets, but also to accumulate more power. And that's what they're doing right now. And they have a policing bill which is shoveling power in their hands, as Britain continues its ever escalating trajectory towards turning into another Hungary. So we need to spell this out, because what the police force said, I'm not accusing them of lying. I'd like to know what the truth is in Bristol. I'd like to know what the basis of their reports were, and we can see how they've been used. Run over. It's important to talk about. Now, let's bring in these 2 brilliant guests who are going to cheer us up. Mathew Lawrence and Laurie Laybourn. Hello. How are you both doing?
Well. How are you?
Oh, well. Hi, hello. Fancy seeing you here.
Indeed.
You're looking both very, lockdown's been crueler and kinder to some. I'd say very kind to both of you.
Well, we didn't just do a workout before we came on either. I mean, you look fabulous, though, of course.
No, I don't.
The hair in particular.
Yeah,
okay,
the sheen of sweat.
Do not troll me over the hair. Yeah, exactly. I'm using sweat instead of hair wax to run out. Lovely. Cheers, everyone. I look terrible. But there was just 2.5 weeks until National Haircut Day.
Yeah.
appointment is 8:05 p.m. I won't sleep the night before. So let's just dive in, because your book, Planet on Fire, it is Planet on Fire. No, it's not Planet is on Fire. It's Planet on Fire. Get the title right. Planet on Fire, which comes out next month, but just pre-order it, everyone. It's a must read book, which Verso, who published my first book, have published. Now let's talk about it, because I have done. Yeah, I think there's problems with the title of this episode. So we'll just change the narrative. Okay, let's just start, shall we? Is it too late to save the world? Who wants to start?
Just to jump in on the sort of the ending of the world. So I'm going to agree with people who got in touch with you saying, maybe the framing's not right. And the book definitely is exactly about the potential and transformative potential responding to the sort of ecological catastrophe we're in. But I do think it's also quite important to stress that in some ways, like, what is one of the constants of the last sort of 500 years of history, really it is the ending of worlds and ecological catastrophe and the extinction of sort of social life and economic life worlds that come with that, whether that's sort of, the conquest, the completely barbaric violence of genocidal conquest of the Americas, indigenous communities right up to today, their life worlds being destroyed, their ecological worlds that they've sort of nurtured and sustained being destroyed, British imperial rule in India and the way it's sort of brutalized both sort of human lives and nature. So I think what's unique about right now is not that sort of worlds are being threatened, but that there's a sort of set of interconnected and accelerating crises that are really sort of quite literally heating up. I think that's what makes it distinct, but I think absolutely it can be addressed, but it's a political challenge above all, I guess, to do that.
Laurie,
and we've got to appreciate, right, that we have had a problem over the last many decades of growing awareness around the environmental crisis. It's that people in positions of influence and leadership haven't necessarily been focusing on it as much as they probably should have, and I think it's understandable that on the one side, you've got people who really want to stress the terror, the horror of the situation we find ourselves in. It's a very scary thing. And sometimes those people have chafed up against others who say, sort of frames around disaster and the horror of the thing can be a bit, could potentially be disabling. You could become overcome by how horrendous the situation is, and it's not a positive frame. And what's been really interesting over the last couple of years with the emergence of Extinction Rebellion, the school striker movement, is to watch a group of people play around with frames, with narratives that do speak to the scale and pace of what's happening to the environment, what's happening to the climate, what's happening to other parts of the environment as well. And it's been very interesting to see how, on one side, more alarming frames have, you could say, been quite effective. That we've had campaigners being very honest about how bad this is has helped sort of break open the political discussion. The question now is, in the face of these pretty vertiginous stakes that we find ourselves facing, how do we frame it so that we can tackle the root problems? The odds are pretty horrendous. They're stacked against us. We know this. That can be both disabling and it can be enormously scary, but it can also be a motivator as well. And so there's a whole thicket there of issues when it comes to being honest about the situation, but also doing so in a way that can then engender the huge action, the positive energy that we need in response.
So if we're going to look, let's take a kind of balance sheet, well, not a balance sheet, but how bad, let's look at the reality of the environmental situation facing the world. Because obviously, not obviously, FYI for people, we're supposed to by 2030 meet a global target of keeping global temperature increases below 1.5 centigrade above pre-industrial levels. But we've already seen the terrible consequences, of course, of the climate emergency, from extreme weather, droughts, destabilized ecosystems, population movements. A lot of stuff has already happened. But how bad is the current situation? Just stop.
It's almost as bad as it is possible to conceive, and probably worse even than that. To put it lightly, we're in a situation where over the last number of years in particular, the scale of the climate crisis has really started to emerge, I think, into the political imaginary, right? And as you say, that can be summed up by saying that we need to be reducing the gases, the greenhouse gases that we're pumping into the atmosphere through driving, through building things, through heating our homes and that kind of stuff, by about half globally come 2030 and then completely by 2050. And we need to do that because if we don't, the temperature will keep going up, and that will lead to all the horrendous kind of consequences that we hear about. Now, the problem is that the climate crisis is only one part of an overall picture of destabilization that we see across the natural world, right? We've got the climate crisis, we've got the destruction of biodiversity, so of animals and plants. We're both destroying their population, so the number of them are decreasing, and we're also completely destroying certain types. We're leading them into extinction. And then you've got other problems with what we're doing to nature as well. The destruction of land, the depletion of soils, which we need to be nutrient rich so that we can grow our crops, for example. And the list goes on, overuse of water. They aren't just distinct, sort of discrete problems that are unconnected to each other. They interact with each other. So warmer temperatures can threaten the living conditions for certain species, which could push them into extinction. So all of these things are related together. We are seeing an overall destabilization of the biosphere, of the overall life support system that the Earth provides us and has been the basis for, non-human life, for animals and plants, but also the stable basis in which our civilizations can exist. And that is horrifying, and it is unprecedented, not just in human history, but in some cases millions, if not billions of years. And so in short, it is an unbelievably bad situation. And the full picture of it is something that politics, as is currently constituted, mainstream leaders are yet really getting their head around, at least in what they're saying.
Go for it, Matt.
Well, I mean, just to give you one example, so there was a study out quite recently around 1 degree of temperature increase, of global average temperature increase, will lead to parts of the world where roughly 1 billion people live being sort of basically uninhabitable. The sort of level of heat rising up sort of to a degree that it's just simply not really possible for humans to live there. And then in the sort of worst case scenario within that study, which I think was a US study, 1/3 of the globe will have conditions that approach it that are typically only really seen around the Sahara right now. Now that's not for many decades, and that's only one potential trajectory, but it gives you the scale of the devastation that is potentially there if we continue on a trajectory without change. And I think that also speaks to a wider point, which Laurie kind of alludes to, is that there hasn't been enough action. And that really, again, it's when you think about it, it's just extraordinary that isn't just like front and center of everything we do. And obviously, in some ways, that's linked to how the climate crisis is sort of a racialized crisis and a racist crisis. It links to sort of wide and deep imbalances in power, both within our economy in the UK, but of course, the global economy, the extraction of resources and the wealth of the global south to the north. And so I think, it really should be front and center and just, the thing that sort of completely dominates. And yet we still have a situation where, much of contemporary politics, and, there has been really important shifts, Labour's 2019 manifesto, potentially, there are other areas of hope, but where you often have sort of politics and the political offer, and then at the end it's like, oh yeah, no, a climate offer, rather than it being or an environmental offer in the round. And in some ways, it's how do we get to getting that position where actually everything is about systemic transformation, not sort of like, well, we're going to tinker here and then here's some things for the climate and the environment at the back end. But it really is, as Laurie said, sort of the scale, the pace, and the damage are really unprecedented trends.
Can I drop the C-bomb in? I should probably clarify what that is. Capitalism. Capitalism, just to be clear, capitalism. We're talking about capitalism. Let's talk about how does capitalism fit into this? Because some would say, well, I don't know why I'm throwing this in, but, obviously a lot on the right are basically like, you little watermelons. And the reason they call us watermelons is anyone who's familiar with the fruit, the watermelon, is aware of generally unless it's a rotten watermelon, the colour, which is, of course, it is green on the outside and red on the inside. And of course, what they're suggesting is, they pretend they're green, but they're just using this because they're trying to find a way to bring in socialism, and they're just latched onto this to make their socialist dreams possible. And they'd say, well, actually, capitalism can provide the answers. Why leave capitalism alone? Stop narking on about capitalism all the time. So where does capitalism, I like the way I just added my little Milton Friedman stand-in. That's who I now am, a Milton Friedman. It's going to be a nightmare explaining this to all my subscribers. Laurie, go for it. Capitalism.
We tell
Matt. Okay, Laurie.
Can I just jump in on the watermelon for a little?
Yes, Matt, jump in on the watermelon.
Well, actually, so here's it. So it's actually the phrase watermelon of green on the outside, red on the inside. It's actually a phrase that was coined by fossil fuel denialists on the far right, and actually Marine Le Pen's father, the guy who sort of created and led the National Front in France. There's images of him cutting a watermelon on stage at their political rallies. So it's quite an interesting history of where that term came from and sort of what it denotes and sort of the pathologies of fossil capital. People like Andreas Malm sort of speaks to that. I mean, and I'll hand it to Laurie, but obviously this crisis is inseparable from the sort of fundamental dynamics of extraction, expansion, enclosure, exploitation that is rooted systemically in how capitalism operates over the centuries. In different institutions and different formations, you can't escape the sort of environmental crisis is inseparable from capitalism.
So basically, I haven't just become Milton Friedman. I've actually gone full fash. Lovely stuff. Laurie, the C word, capitalism.
We tell a story in a book, right? In fact, it's right at the beginning. We look around and we look at the comments of various people as they try to understand why this is happening, why we have the kind of disaster that I mapped out just now. And you get some people saying, oh, people are psychologically predisposed to being short-termist. You get other people saying, oh, this is a result of all these horrendous dirty technologies we've got ourselves hooked onto and that kind of stuff, right? And this sort of often mainstream frame that's trying to comprehend how on earth it got to this point sometimes gestures to the story of Easter Island, of Rapa Nui in the language of the local culture. And this is right out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, or off South America. And you get these stories about how in the 1700s Europeans arrived, the Dutch arrived, and they named it Easter Island because they came upon it on Easter Sunday. And they found, or they claimed to have found, a civilization that had done these extraordinary things, had built the head and torso statues that you see across the island that we now associate, at least in the West, with Easter Island. But the island was a mess. They cut down all the trees. The group of people that seemed to remain on the island were clearly not the advanced civilization that led to those head and torso statues. And as time went on, it became clear to these people that what had happened is that they had overused their environment, which was isolated from the rest of humanity, right? This really is out there, remote, many, 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 many miles from any other country, from any mainland. And they'd overused their resources. They'd destroyed the foundation upon which they could grow food, and their society collapsed. And we can see there the telltale signs of our innate short-termism. These people were just looking out for themselves. They weren't doing it maliciously, but it led to their demise. And they were using technologies, including the creation of these statues, which needed rollers to cut down the trees, roll them along. And that led to the destruction of society. And the world is like a planet-sized Easter Island, where these kind of innate problems that humans have when it comes to dealing with these big issues are leading to disaster. The problem with that story is it turns out it's not true. And the latest scholarship shows that actually the people on the island were probably, prior to the arrival of Europeans, living in a reasonable steady state. They had created certain cultural mechanisms in which it meant that they could manage the sort of the commons on the island in a way that was sustainable. And instead, what led to the demise of the reasonably complex society that we'd seen in Easter Island at that time was disease brought by Europeans, was the persistent slaving, the murder, and the sexual exploitation of the people on that island. You then got to ask yourself the question, well, why on earth was that happening to that island? And the people that were going and doing that, who were coming from Western countries that were the other side of the world, were not doing it for a laugh. They were compelled there by global economic systems that meant that they were seeking out cheap nature and cheap bodies to feed into processes of profit making. And the fact that that story is itself not the mainstream story is an interesting story in itself. It shows you the biases of the mainstream. It shows you that our understanding of how we got to this point has become this sort of depoliticized secular myth, when in fact that it's intimately related to 500 years of the development of an economic system that begins with C, was spread around the world by forces that begin with I and imperialism, and then led us to the position that we find ourselves in now.
Matt, talk about capitalism with me, including, I suppose, I mean, in terms of the way, I mean, because there's so many, I mean, it's multifaceted, but I mean, if we look today, for example, how it was quite interesting, The Guardian had these files last week which revealed that for a long time, various fossil fuel companies were aware that pollution killed people. And in fact, today, it's estimated pollution kills more people globally than cigarettes do, about 8 million people a year. So they've known this for years, but they deliberately lobbied against clean air regulations, which would have saved lives. And that's just one example, which is, you know, there was a study a few years ago by a couple of academics in the United States, which claimed that the US wasn't actually a democracy, it was an oligarchy, because vested interests would always game the system to get to, you know, their self-interest dressed up as political. Well, I mean, that's how it works. Their own economic self-interested was you know, achieved its goals in the political system, even though it went against the interests of the wider population. And obviously, under capitalism, I mean, the US is a very striking example of big money, but the same is true here, even if it's not quite so vulgar, I suppose. They can, I mean, that's one way, isn't it, that these forces can, you know, dominate political systems and have done for a long time in neoliberalism accelerated. But how else? I mean, just talk me through it, kind of your own views on capitalism and how it intersects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. You know, you mentioned sort of the companies. It's not just that they knew; it's that, particularly on the climate science, Exxon was amongst like the earliest, you know, sort of, you know, analysts, and they were the most spot on in some ways of the forecast. So back, you know, as far back as the 60s and 70s, they had a very real sense of where levels of sort of carbon use, extraction, and burning would lead to, and the sort of consequences. So, you know, it's a really sort of like, you know, criminal enterprise in many ways to have continued down that path just for the point of accumulation. I think, you know, you've obviously got that the political lobbying and the sort of like, you know, the sort of wedding together of the state and, you know, a capitalist state and, you know, private accumulation processes and sort of profit making with major corporations in particular. But in some ways, sort of stepping back, there's almost a sort of, you know, deeper logics at work. And I guess there's a sort of point to two, that sort of capitalism as sort of social relation, as a sort of way for organizing production, as a way for sort of organizing societies, really sort of embeds and drives towards the climate crisis. So the first thing it does, and these are also incidentally things that, you know, the response and transformative sort of liberatory response has to push back against. So the first is it sort of naturalizes social relations. So it casts as sort of things that just are, that's just how they are. Things like, you know, work, how work is organized, for what purpose, of social relations in terms of, you know, social reproduction. And that then sort of bakes in hierarchies of power, bakes in hierarchies of decision making, who gets to say what we invest in, what we control, what we do, how we work, why we work. And so that naturalization is a sort of deep problem to resist. But then at the same time, it completely relies upon ultimately sort of what Marx called the free gifts of nature. So, you know, whether it's rivers, you know, sort of fossil fuels, you know, and of course there's work to extract these, to use these, to sort of transform, you know, the metabolism of, you know, natural systems into profit. But it sort of is completely reliant on that. And I suppose, you know, the alternative to sort of move beyond this at the very, you know, the first two things in some ways at a sort of systemic level is one, to actually insist the economy and sort of markets and, you know, how our economy develops is not natural, it's not beyond or pre-political, it's exactly shaped by collective decisions, shaped by institutions that we ultimately can control if we can democratize them, and we can actually sort of transform, therefore, and that's the hopeful message, we can indeed transform the economy, while at the same time as pushing back against sort of how capitalism sort of naturalizes things. We need to denaturalize social relations and economic relations. We also need to re-embed the economy back into natural systems. So we need to sort of, you know, bring ourselves better into alignment with ecological relations, ecological reproduction. And so that's sort of the double challenge. And I think, the sort of response may well be, and we cover this a little bit in the book, of sort of, I guess, the mainstream and sort of, neoliberalism as sort of market enforcing process will say, well, no worries, we'll just put a price on carbon, we'll throw in some incentives here, and it'll all be fine. Not only do we think that won't work, partly because the accumulated stock of carbon emissions and of environmental degradation is sort of so extensive and so late in the day that it won't work, but it also misses a sort of emancipatory potential that we just won't get with capitalism. And so one sort of to make it sort of tangible, one example would be sort of electric vehicles. Yes, we can maybe incentivize at very extensive public subsidy the transition to electric vehicles, but in some ways the transition of mobility, which is completely bound up in questions of power, of race, of inequality. So when we think about mobility, we want to be thinking about new models of sort of public luxury, public transport, decommodified free provision. And so in that transition, reimagine our social worlds as well as our environmental worlds. And that's obviously something that capitalism just simply is not equipped to, and indeed stands in tension against, to do for us.
Now, I mean, partly we've answered this, but just throw it in. In terms of the world failing to act on the existential crisis facing humanity, because actually, obviously, short-termism built into capitalism, you can see why, but it's not going to be great for capitalism in the long run if we face the destruction of civilization as we know it. And but also, why is this an act of justice? You've also touched on that. But yeah, Laurie, do you want to go for that?
It's partly because that history that I mentioned, right? You've got a situation where many of those who have always been on the front line of not just the injustices of our economic system, but also the negative environmental consequences, are the people who've contributed least to the problem, right? So let's take the UK. It is a country and that has existed now for a decent amount of time. And in that time, it has contributed the fifth largest contribution to the cumulative amount of emissions that go into the atmosphere, right? So think of the atmosphere roughly like a bathtub. It's the total amount that causes the overall problem. You fill up too much, it's spilling over the sides. And this country, the history of this country has contributed about the fifth largest amount. And in the process, it's become the fifth wealthiest country. It's also spread a certain economic model, a model of development around the world. And in the process of doing that through imperialism, has had negative implications on countries, particularly in the global south, that live on to this day. Those countries are the ones who are in positions around the world in which they are seeing a disproportionate amount of environmental impact. They're also the ones who are least responsible. Many of the countries that are, say, former colonies of Britain in Africa are somewhere around the low hundreds or mid hundreds in the cumulative league table for just the climate problem. And because of these historical legacies, they're also in a situation where they may not have the resources or the capabilities in which they will be able to defend themselves, at least relative to what Britain will be able to do as things really heat up. And that isn't just a thing between countries, it is a thing within countries as well and across communities. Those who live in this country or say the US, where there is a increasingly articulate political message on this, it is those communities who have often been the ones who have been most disenfranchised and negatively affected by our economic systems are also the ones who are increasingly on the front line of the environmental issue. So we've got to deal with that massive inequality, both across countries and within countries, not just because we have a moral responsibility to do so, both historically, but also in the present and, of course, into the future. Younger people will be, by definition, impacted more by this than people who've lived longer. We're not just doing it for a moral reason, we're doing it for a practical reason as well. And we see a similar situation with the pandemic. To put it bluntly, in a high inequality, low cooperation world, we don't have the capability to deal with this effectively. And alongside the moral imperative, there is also that practical imperative, what often in, say, in the context of the pandemic and vaccine distribution is called, sort of enlightened self-interest, where we can't do this global problem unless we are working together as a world, and high cooperation requires, by definition almost, lower inequality and therefore high levels of trust and greater levels of an effective response.
Mathew, before we segue into, we did promise optimism. Before we do that, do you want to just add your own specific contributions there?
Yeah, I mean, so I think Laurie summed it up pretty well, but I think it's important when we think about sort of the justice question, which I think that in some ways gets to the heart of sort of different political approaches. So exactly going back to my previous point around, we may well be able to decarbonize our economy fairly rapidly. That leaves aside some of the other sort of environmental systems that are in acute crisis, but we may well be able to decarbonize fairly rapidly, not nearly rapidly enough, but fairly rapidly some of our industrial systems, our transport systems, etc., etc. But that will leave out the sort of dual justice. One, that point that Laurie made, that sort of those who are sort of already bearing the brunt of this catastrophe are those who are sort of least responsible as societies, as individuals, for the sort of current state of environmental crisis. So that's an injustice. But then as we sort of transform, that injustice question of, how we organize work, extraordinarily disfiguring inequalities of wealth and power. And then, of course, mentioned earlier, sort of, the injustice, the climate crisis is a racist crisis in the sense like fossil power, fossil capital has, extracted and degraded the global south in particular, for broadly sort of, white sort of nations in the global north. And so I think it's just completely entangled and inseparable from questions of systemic injustice. And therefore, any sort of meaningful emancipatory response has to sort of not just talk about decarbonisation and sort of rebalancing, and realigning our sort of economic systems with sort of natural systems, but about rooting out sort of these injustices that weave through the core of the, sort of the story of both how we got here and where we're heading towards unless we change.
So in terms of the way forward, I mean, the Green New Deal is obviously something which is much spoken about in progressive circles. In the United States, the likes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been a particularly prominent champion. And in this country, Labour went in 2019 with the Green Industrial Revolution, which the Tories have raided in rhetoric, if not in substance, which we can talk about. But this was, and I suppose without going through the bitterness of what happened in 2019, but I did that in a book anyway. So, but a lot of people involved in that, I suppose, would be frustrated that that message was not in any way relevant to the 2019 election campaign in the way they would have wanted. I suppose, given Labour was arguably doomed at that point, maybe that wouldn't have been the best 5 days. Otherwise, it would have been even more buried under that rubble. But it was, actually, people look back at the policy proposals, they were obviously very, very good. So should we just talk about that? The Green New Deal, Green Industrial Revolution, whatever we call it. I had Steve Turner from Unite the other day talking about his own perspective from a trade union perspective on that. Laurie, do you want to talk about that? Those kind of responses and where maybe their limits are and where they could go further?
So to put it bluntly, right now in mainstream politics, which I'm saying I think the Green New Deal has entered into, that is really the only credible plan that we see being there in mainstream politics, essentially. We are in a situation where we have got to, this is at the heart of it, we have got to expedite all of the investments that really needed to happen when probably all of us were born. We need to expedite those and get them going really quick. We need to mobilize the extraordinary potential of the state as a spender and a coordinator to do that. And because of the reasons that we just went through, it needs to be done in a way that deals with, is alive to and deals with existing inequalities, and also is able to maximize in the jargon, co-benefits, the wonderful upsides of a lot of those changes that, whisper it, we could have been doing anyway, like making sure that transport wasn't as dirty and having shared public space and that kind of stuff. I think one of the issues this decade, one of the defining stories of this decade could be that you will see some countries beginning to implement a version, roughly, of that kind of Green New Deal strategy. COP26, the major UN climate conference that's being held in Glasgow at the end of this year, I think could be ground zero for a kind of status quo triumphalism, where, to put it bluntly, neoliberalism or a modified version of it gives this a go. And it does that by saying, okay, we accept this, you were right, the school kids, that this is a serious problem now, and we're going to unleash the kind of scale investment that's needed. So it's not just a case of, saying we're going to push the investments that needed. It's also providing the enabling policies to do so, like spending big, like we're hearing Joe Biden talk about in the US. And that is absolutely some progress, but it can hit up against two problems. One, which is at the heart of the Green New Deal, the bit where I don't think it will, a mainstream response will not follow through in a Green New Deal, is adhering to elements of equity and really having at its heart an analysis of inequality and then a response that begins to undo a lot of present and historical injustice. The second thing is, even if it incorporated all that kind of stuff as well, it needs an analysis of the consumption model at the heart of our economic system. You could swap dirty for clean as much as you like, but you are still going to be causing extraordinary environmental damage in the process of making those changes, which are, of course, better than the dirty alternatives, and to meet up with the growing demand for more stuff, for more material consumption that we are essentially saying is going to keep happening year on year and year and year over the course of trying to deal with the environmental problem. And this is an area where I think this analysis is a complement to the Green New Deal, but it's one where policies that are in or around the Green New Deal really need to get to the heart of, is that this consumption model and consumption, the current conception of just year on year increasing the amount of material stuff that we're using without necessarily understanding its impacts on our well-being, that's an area where the Green New Deal and conception of it are going further, and we explore a number of ways to deal with that in the book, which I will leave Matt to explain.
Oh, Matt, there it is. Bam! Looked at you. Well, catch. Yeah. Go for it.
So I think in some ways it's key to understand in some ways the political crisis of the climate crisis is that we don't have power, essentially. So, the 2019 manifesto was stuffed full of ideas that are exactly sort of, bending towards the ambition, scale, and institutional transformation we need. And the problem is not we don't have the ideas necessarily. It's how do we sort of build the political coalitions that can overcome entrenched interests, powerful entrenched interests, whether it's rentier giants, fossil fuel giants, this sort of coalition, the carbon coalition. How do we overcome them? And so, some of the things, Laurie just draws, to give you an example of that, I say we've got all the answers, not us in the book, although we offer a few, but the broader movement that's pushing for transformation. When we talk about, a new consumption model, it could be in place of sort of privatized consumption. It could be a sort of 21st century commons and sort of universal basic services. So, reimagining, decommodified free public transport, towns and sort of cities turned over to sort of shared spaces, parks, forms of public luxury and public consumption. And in some ways, the city in some ways, and Mike Davis, the American sort of historian, kind of has this phrase around the cities being sort of the incubator of sort of ecological luxury. So right now it's intense carbon consumption, but it's got the potential to incubate sort of a post-carbon luxury for all. And we can go through it. We can think about how we can democratize production and provision. So instead of producing for profit, it's producing for environmental and social needs. And again, we know how to do that. We can think about ownership structures. We can think about how companies are governed, reclaiming them from finance, turning them over to social needs. And we explore all these things. I think then there's that sort of structural problem of the Green New Deal. It comes at the end of a long downturn in capitalism. So if you look at all the stats, sort of broadly a downwards trend on productivity, on investment, on output. So it's a very stagnant situation. So in some ways that enables something like a Green New Deal to really sort of build a big coalition, because Steve Turner and sort of there'll be a lot of good unionized work in building out the infrastructures, the industries, the institutions of a post-carbon sort of future, and sort of a plentiful one at that and an equitable one at that. But again, it's about how do we construct the political antagonisms, the political coalitions that can sort of win that future. And that's really in some ways the key challenge for everyone fighting for that type of future right now.
So just finally, final little part. In terms of where we are now, so Biden etc. Labour, I've got to the point I can't help. When I mention Labour, I laugh. Not a good sign, is it? Generally speaking, but that I can't help it. There's nothing I can do about it. I say Labour. I mean, I'd love to know where Labour are on this and everything else. To be fair, Ed Miliband's in that position, and he, in that shadow cabinet, I would say is a force for good. He actually believes in something, so that helps. So in terms of where things are at with contemporary politics, and in terms of strategy, what do we actually do strategically? How, in this great struggle, we're going to have obviously lockdown, relaxing. We're going to have a summer of hedonism, but we'll be able to
and haircuts.
Hedonism and
haircuts and hedonism. That's definitely, and other H's. So, Laurie, what's your in terms of on that? Where we're at in terms of contemporary politics, and how do we struggle? I'm asking for struggle.
Well, I think we can learn. Well, there's an enormous amount we need to learn from across the world. One area that, as you mentioned there, is particularly interesting is the US. And over the last couple of years, the sort of emergence of this amazing ferment of action and attention on the environmental crisis that has seen, Green New Deal shoot to the top of the political agenda in at times in the US. Underneath it is an increasingly mature, what I would call ecosystem of influence of groups that I think we need to have our own kind of UK translation of. It's not like we're starting from day one at all, but there's a lot I think we can learn over there. You've got very mature, increasingly mature social movements that are linked explicitly to the environmental agenda, the Sunrise Movement being one that is at the forefront, but a number of others, including frontline communities who've been fighting against fossil fuel infrastructure and pipelines for a very long time. And there's a tradition that goes back even further in indigenous communities in the US. So you've got these increasingly mature social movements, something which at times has not necessarily been on a mass scale and to the level of radicalism, particularly when it comes to its economic analysis that we've seen in the UK. That has maybe started to change or move to a new level of development with things like Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for the Future and the sort of whole assortment of social movements that are coming from various quarters on the environment. This is another reason why the policing bill could be a particular problem, because where would we be in the environmental debate if we hadn't have had the Extinction Rebellion occupation of London in April 2019 or the school strike movement that's occurring, right? So you've got these social movements that are then have got this amazing policy ballast to them that's supported by a range of academics, thinkers, writers, and a few upstart think tanks, often from a younger generation, who are saying, not just making the narrative around a Green New Deal reach the political mainstream, but they're bottoming it out. They've got plans, detailed plans for how you would do this. So there's little excuses for existing decision makers to ignore it, or for then, hopefully when these people get in charge, to then deliver on it. And then they are connected to politicians, to people who are delivering, advocating, bringing that message to the front line, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and are very capable in doing so. And that structure seems to be working quite effectively. And that's evidenced by the amazing work that was done to pressure the Biden campaign to take on a more radical stance when it came to, or proportionate stance when it came to dealing with the environmental emergency. And I think we've seen that continue as then that campaign has become the Biden administration. So there's a huge amount that we can learn there. We've got many of the constituents that exist upon that sort of transmission pathway, if you could call it, that I just described there. And we need to look at how we can get everything lined up in a position where things are really buzzing. And when it comes to the Labour Party, I think, our translation, you could say, of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a kind of, amazing person who's come along and dragged along with other people and a lot of supporters and helpers, the Overton window across in American politics. I think our translation of that here in the UK is sort of a caucus of younger MPs, either already in Parliament or being elected as soon as possible, who come in and bring this message very articulately, and in the process help drag a lot of the mainstream conversation in Parliament, so that in one sense, there is an outrider there for then, say, the centre of Labour Party policy, who are saying, guys, you really need to keep coming in this direction and holding people to account in that way.
Matt.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so a couple of things. I think, your point about struggle is critical. And, in some ways, returning right back to the start of, your intro and reading, great intro. And I think in some ways, like Sisters Uncut, I think, and the demonstrations in recent weeks have really actually shown one potential path forwards. I think there's going to be multiple paths, but I think that shows a really powerful way forwards, which is like social movements that, aren't, too much focused on sort of parliamentary politics. They exist outside of that. They might have sort of a relation, but they are sort of focused on building social power from the, and interconnected struggles, whether it's, renting, sort of gender-based violence, whatever it might be. They are building social power on the streets and demonstrations in sort of social networks. So I think continuing to do that, and I think it'll be really interesting to see whether, when lockdown eases, the sort of momentum from school strikers and sort of Green New Deal movements can then sort of spill back out onto the streets in the run up to COP, which is COP26, which is the sort of big climate conference in Glasgow at the end of the year. I think then clearly, in and beyond the party style, strategy, and I think James Schneider on recently, he's done a series of very good essays on sort of that relationship and sort of how do you sort of seek to build leverage, seek to build power within an institution like the Labour Party, and sort of thinking about not just sort of the Labour Party, which is obviously a very particular institution, but then sort of the state, from both the UK state, but sort of global, sort of how states interact within a global sort of capitalist system. What is our plan for the state? Thinking about that. I think then, we need to be thinking about what is the sort of, and this is where I think there are real strengths, because ultimately, like, our offer is one of, it might be growth of a different kind, but it's growth of thriving life, of resilient communities, of joy and collective creativity, rather than sort of the politically enforced limits that we have today. But I think we need to think about that post carbon sort of coalition. And so what that might be? It might be thinking about how do we centre an economy on care and the valorisation and the rewarding of care work in all its dimensions, reparative care work, so the sustaining of life, which is really the central function, but which is consistently sort of denied its proper share under capitalism. And then that begins to build out quite different sort of coalitions. It's about thinking about Steve Turner's sort of members. What is sort of a green industrial strategy that really takes seriously just transitions in place, not just in aggregate, but thinking about like what would it look like for Teesside and sort of the chemical sort of hub up there. How would we sort of transform steel in the UK and sort of decarbonize steel, which is roughly 1/10 of all global emissions. So like what are the sort of specific ways we can combine material interests with the political strategy to change that? And then I think we might disagree with it, but in some ways what I think we also need is which goes back again to your early point, we need a sense of like transformative optimism that yes, it is a very grave situation, but we broadly have to say, well, actually this is a moment to transform and transcend beyond the limits of the institutions and ways of life of the fossil fuel age, and build out a much more emancipatory, much more free, much more sort of liberated future for all of us. And I think the political challenge there, and I think this is a big challenge, I think, for the left more widely, not just on climate and environmental issues, but exactly the scale of the challenge and transformation we need is the thing that sort of makes people worried and anxious and concerned for their livelihoods, their jobs, their futures. And so in some ways, the message to me seems to be that actually, in an era of increasing environmental instability and inequality, the much, much more dangerous path, much more unstable path, is cleaving to the status quo or defending just marginality and tweaks. And actually, a systemic crisis is much more safely met with ambitious systemic responses. So I think that's got to be at the centre of us of politics and what we're sort of struggling for going forwards, whether that's in workplaces, in communities, on the streets, within and beyond the infrastructures and institutions of the fossil fuel age.
So actually, while you were speaking, I changed the title, which is the only time I've ever done that. In
That's cheating, isn't it? That's cheating.
Yes.
The whole frame's gone.
Yeah, I cheated. This is how we save humanity, which is more a far more empowering, less demobilizing title. So the podcast will go out with that title. So then people listen to the podcast and go, "There's nothing depressing about the title. What are you talking about?" But there we have it. That was a brilliant exposition. Thank you so much, both of you. People just. Obviously, now you're all going to pre-order Planet on Fire. Come on. Seriously, both are two of the best progressive thinkers we have. So we're lucky to have them. And everyone should read their work. And this book obviously is a masterpiece. So do. If you're feeling depressed, look, I mean, it's not been easy. So this is definitely a book which will galvanize you to fight for, to save us, and also build a just, sustainable world. That's what we should be fighting for. So thank you, thank you both. I look forward to having a nice golden pint with you in the sun.
Oh, God.
Nice,
I know it will come.
Yeah. To paraphrase Queen Elizabeth II, we will drink again. So anyway, it's a real. I'm gonna go.
I like it. Good to go with it.
In fact, make that the title.
Maybe I will. We will drink again. Yeah, I'm not trolled enough, so I thought I'd add to it. Seriously, that was very, very powerful stuff. So thank you so much. I owe you both a pint, and please do pre-order, everyone. And thank you both so much. I'll see you soon.
Thanks for having us.
Take care. Take care, all.
They're great. See, brilliant. So we're very lucky. I know we don't normally look. I stopped doing Thursday shows. I just thought it'd be nice, ad hoc. You know, it's not the rule of 6 yet. What are you going to do with your lives anyway? I just thought, why not do it? So it was good to have them live, and obviously this will go out to the podcast and elsewhere, so people can listen, think it through, act upon it, buy their books. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into a very ad hoc show. We really, really appreciate it. I just want to do a little shout out to Rob Hogg, Adriana Pexato from Portugal, and Tirana. Thank you for your support throughout the show. Thank you, everybody else. We need to work out a next documentary to do. I've got a few ideas, but I'd really appreciate your help on Patreon. If you subscribed, you can help us decide what documentaries we do. But now it's easier to do a documentary than it was before, that's for sure. So do help us out there. Do subscribe. If you're on YouTube, subscribe and click the subscribe button. On the podcast, leave a review, press 5 stars. It just helps because then other people listen to the podcast. That's the whole point. And subscribe and spread the word. But we really appreciate it. We'll be back. Oh, just quickly, actually, just so you've got a kind of like little... My producer's going to be like, can you just go off air now? We've got Jim Sterling, who's the iconic YouTuber. That interview is coming up imminently. It was a very big pleasure to interview Jim Sterling about being a prominent non-binary person, about gaming, about wrestling. We covered a lot of ground. We also are interviewing Emma DeBerry about her book, What White People Can Do Next, from allyship to coalition. So that will be up very soon on both YouTube and the podcast. So very much looking forward to that. We've got loads of stuff coming up over the next few days. We've got George the Poet. We're going to be interviewing him. We've got loads of people interviewing. It's very exciting. And as well as that, documentaries, videos, rants on YouTube, Facebook, on the podcast, on Instagram, wherever else, in part of our burgeoning media empire. So thank you for your support, for those who've been supporting this. Thanks for our guests. I will see you live for whatever we're talking about this Sunday at midday, 12 o'clock, which has proved to be better. I think people are much happier with that because you've got lives. So I look forward to see you live on Sunday, and look out for the interviews and videos to come. I'll see you very soon.